Hi, my name is Anabel, and I'll be talking about the inner and outer view of zoot suits among Mexican American youth in Los Angeles in the 1940s. This is a part of Professor Summer Sandoval's Intro to Latinx and Chicanx history class. The zoot suit is a type of men's suit that grew in popularity by the 1940s. It features high-waisted draped pants that were tightly cuffed at the ankles, and a long coat jacket that had wide shoulder pads and lapels. Its origins are not confirmed, but it can be linked to African American urban jazz culture starting in the late 1930s. Some historians also argue that Mexican American and Filipino youths had been wearing suits of this fashion generations before. Even though its origins aren't clear, suits served as an important aspect of Mexican American youth culture in LA around the 1940s. Exploring this topic allows us to better understand the use of fashion as a varied form of self-expression and rebellion against current conditions being faced. On the other hand, when we look at general outsider reactions to this fashion statement, especially in the media, we can see a deep-seated racist and prejudiced lens that was used to view Mexican Americans in the United States. Many who wore zoot suits took up the name and the identity known as the Pacheco. Pachecos in the southwest of the country were often youth who grew up with Mexican parents that immigrated into the U.S. during the Mexican Revolution. These youth were caught between two very different cultures: the strict and traditional Mexican culture in their homes and the larger U.S. culture they experienced once they stepped outside. The Pacheco culture can be seen as a result of this cross between Mexican and Anglo-American culture, and a way for them to create an image of themselves that they agreed with, outside of how they were viewed in the American society. In an opinion piece written by Timothy Turner in the Los Angeles Times in March 1943, we get an idea of how the people in Los Angeles, specifically Anglo-Americans, viewed zoot suits and the people like the Pachecos who wore them. Turner ridicules the exaggerated proportions of the zoot suit and equally ridicules the men that saw them as fashionable, saying, "The zoot suit seems to have been an attempt by some malicious designers to make a style embodying all the worst features of men's clothes for the last 50 years. Turner also brings his vivid descriptions to life with a comic which features caricature-like drawings of zoot suiters with extremely large proportions of clothes. From this, we can see that during the time of the early and mid-1940s, when the suits were rising in popularity, the majority of the urban population were very surprised by this fashion style. Nobel laureate Octavio Paz describes the zoot suit as defying North American fashion standards during those times, which followed the lines of fashion being comfortable. This made the zoot suit look very unreasonable and excessive in their eyes. This was also during the Second World War, when major decisions were being taken to help the war efforts of the U.S. Army. This included more control over the distribution of resources, known as rationing. In March 1942, the War Production Board called for rationing on the manufacturing of suits and clothes that contained wool in order to conserve textiles. As such, the making of zoot suits was banned. This, however, did not stop the demand for them, and very soon tailors began to make these suits to satisfy the large number of people that wanted them, specifically in Los Angeles and New York. So, Pachecos and their zoot suits were beginning to look very unpatriotic and were accused of trying to sabotage U.S. war efforts. Turner racially profiles zoot suiters by referring to them as Mexicans and Negroes. He also reveals his biased view of these men with his line, "In Los Angeles, zoot suits are still widely worn among a certain clientele on the other side of the tracks, worn with gusto by young men who are not afraid to be different." By saying that they're on the other side of the tracks, he separates these minority groups from the larger Anglo-American population and reveals this level of segregation that existed in Los Angeles at that time. There were neighborhoods like Chavez Ravine, Alpine Street, and Temple Street, which became areas that mainly housed immigrant families, specifically Mexican Americans, because of the limited housing and job options being presented to those of certain races in the US. In the eyes of Anglo Americans, Mexicans could never become true Americans, and they were not intending on helping them make it happen. Mexicans were looked down upon, and the taking up of the Zoot suit as well as the rise of Pacheco culture gave the larger American society as well as the media an excuse to keep painting a negative picture of Mexican American youth as being rebellious delinquents, or in the case of Turner's newspaper piece, as people who don't fit in. There was obviously a huge difference between how Mexicans wearing these Zoot suits saw and symbolized their fashion choices, and how outsiders saw it. The interesting thing is that there wasn't only one reason for Mexican American youths to be wearing these suits. For the Pachucos, their fashion played an important part in the larger role of resisting against the racism that existed within their communities. The racism that prevented them from having the same experiences as their white peers. The suit was an act of defiance, as some of them engaged in petty crimes and harassed white sailors who kept up the racism they were experiencing. For others, the suit was a way to fit in with other Mexican American youth, as it was very popular at that time. They would risk suspicion from the police in order to be in style. It's clear, however, that despite whatever intentions Mexican American youth had for wearing the Zoot suit or taking up the Pachuco culture, media interpretations as well as the age-old biased opinions of Mexican Americans in the US would remain the same. Thank you for listening.